The best bikes that you can find for road riding are already been made. Yes, they are definitely classics and gems, but definitely still very relevant, actually better than the bikes that are available today new. Let's review one of these classic bikes in all of its glory and the gems you can find in your neck of the woods after this. Welcome to I Know a Guy Bicycles, hanging with a guy. Hey, I'm Justin the Guy, and we were talking about this particular Quantum Klein from years of past, years of old. But you know, a lot of these bikes that are on the used market is actually hidden gems, and matter of fact, they are so relevant to today versus the newer bikes. So their complicity and overdevelopment. Just to start off, you're going to go just as fast, just as far, and just as efficient. And you can actually do this with actually a lot more style. Let's dive into this particular Klein Quantum and where it came from and all the hidden features that are not in today's bikes that actually makes it a lot easier for you to own and to maintain. And this particular gem's paint job is just to die for. But I just did the tune-up on it. It's all ready to go. Just need to wrap the bars, and we'll just talk about it while we're doing the wrap job. Not that kind of wrapping. So Gary Klein built a lot of bikes in Chehalis, Washington. He was actually an MIT engineer that got into cycling. So he's not in the traditional race form of getting into cycling. So that being said, it's a lot more of a tech perspective versus brand name of a former racer perspective. So going from there, in Chehalis, Washington, which is really close to Seattle, they built up a lot of bikes there using Boeing aircraft aluminum, which Boeing actually had a huge facility, still does today, in the Seattle area, where they're building a lot of airplanes. Well, during the MIT days, Gary Klein actually built or had I guess a grant of some sort to come up with a different formulated aluminum, and that turned into the granulate tube process. It's kind of like different mixed alloys to draw it out to give it different angles, kind of like a budding of a tubing that a lot of people are familiar with, but taking it to a higher level and definitely giving some steroids. So the internal and external manipulation of wall thicknesses was actually advised from that, where it's shown through a lot of the particular bikes he made over the years. Prior to acquisition of Trek, or basically Klein went to Trek mid-90s, and that's when they were having a little bit of financial issues and so forth. There's a lot of stories on it, but in any case, we were a Trek dealer back in the day, Parker Bikes, and therefore we had an opportunity to pick up the Klein line when they were acquisition. A lot of people say they like the traditional Kleins, that Trek bled them out, marketed them out, all that kinds of things. A lot of negativity came from it, but on the flip side of it, how I see it is more of a positive thing. However, anybody's been interviewed and what have you. Reason being is the Klein older bikes had some issues with the dropouts, went a little bit too fat around the derailleur hangers, which caused them to not shift correctly. And they had a couple other issues. A lot more R&D got put into it because they had the money with Trek to actually put into it to build up a line. So this developed over several years in the later 90s, where they did some really cool stuff. Actually, the engineer, Gary Klein, was able to go out and actually really dive into a lot of the different basically ideas on his drawing board and actually put them to application, which was really cool because seeing it, the first generation going into the stores of the Trek dealers to several years later, you can definitely see a huge jump in an advancement of what they were doing or trying to do within that particular market. Well, that being said, it actually definitely improved the bike line, and in addition to different qualities. Well, Trek acquired Klein, I basically think, because they needed to learn how to weld aluminum, because prior to that they were bonding aluminum together. So kind of a little tricky bit for Trek, but they had a facility in Waterloo, Wisconsin, where they were being underproduced, or underutilized in the particular era. And my buddy John Bradley worked at Trek at the time, went over to Taiwan, noticed that there were some Gary Fishers, the other Gary, line just sitting there and being underperformed. Well, in this particular point, Trek built their facility and they knew they can build a lot more bikes, but the demand for Treks was not as much to fill up the actual production runs that they can produce. So they had an idea of bringing in some other lines. Gary Fisher, Klein Bikes, Le Mans, Bontrager, there you go. So this big push allow Klein to actually build some really cool bikes. And they really kept a good flavor of the high quality aluminum, granite 2 process, as well as the high grade paint that they are known for. A lot of people have seen the Klein if they watch Seinfeld, and when it is Seinfeld's apartment, in the back corner was a Klein very vivid green. So that was more of the late 80s, early 90s. I forget when the series was totally because I'm getting old. But in any case, those are the things. So talking about a little bit of history there with Gary Klein, and that they discontinued their line, or his line, in the early 2000s, right before the 29ers kicked in. So you won't find any 29ers Gary Klein bikes, but you'll still find some good Jim hardtails, and some people have taken those and converted them to gravel bikes. Put a lot of money into it, but pretty cool, and you can do like a 650 B style gravel bike out of those. But this particular one, back to this Quantum story, this was in the late 90s, early 2000s model, probably 2000. And this is when they were known for internal cable routing, which quite honestly, you got to know what you're doing when you lace the cables, especially for the brakes, so you don't get all trickied up there. But the rear derailleurs or the front and rear derailleurs is not too bad. External cables for the brakes, for the front, so all that is straight up pretty decent. Same process. When you look at the welds of these, they're very liquidy. Basically, you don't see a high ridge of the beading of the actual weld. Well, they used a higher grade weld. I'm not sure if it's a higher temperature, but I'm pretty sure. And with that, they were able to get more surface coverage and a little bit stronger area of that particular weld. Well, that being said, basically you get a stronger frame out of those particular welds. Well, the other things that they did was changing the shaping of the tubing. So from the down tube, like the top tube here, down into the bottom bracket would change in direction. In other words, give you more compliance vertically and give you more stiffness in the bottom bracket area into the rear wheel laterally, so it actually gives you better acceleration and that kind of thing. These things ride like a Ferrari. I mean, they are really, really tight on cornering, very, very fast. Let's just put it that way. So that being said, with all those little technical features, and it's not just like the head tube area is fancy, like some of the Diverge from Specialized and that kind of thing. It's the whole particular bike. The rear wheel has dropouts, what are called rear entry dropouts. Those particular dropouts were designed to force the wheel in to the actual frame, so there's no energy loss or slippage by accident from the back end. So that particular dropout, which is not totally new, but actually perfectly designed for the road bike, as well as they carried it with the hardtail mountain bikes. So you can find that as a nice little feature. With that particular stiffness of the actual rear triangle, as well in the mountain bikes, it made it a lot stiffer for those brakes to work. Like V-brakes would span the frame out, where it'd be an actual deduction of brake loss from the frame flex, so you'd have to have a bridge piece. But in any case, this particular bike, very light, very stiff, very fast. Going into the paint job itself is phenomenal. I forget what the cost on it, but it was kind of like 10 times more cost than your standard bike paint. And by doing that, higher grade, this particular one's a great one to show off because it has an acetone multicolor levels to it, and it's super thick. So in other words, if you're doing detailing, which I did on this one, and added ceramic coating as well as I did to this one, it really makes that paint pop. It is just phenomenal, and I'll show you here in the sun momentarily. But that being said, with the particular paint, they also did painted decals. So basically the silver decal you see, that was the first paint layer that they sprayed the bike with. And after that, they stencil the decals out and then painted the top color on top of that and pulled the decals. So therefore, all the decaling is not a sticker, it's actually painted on there. So attention to detail was definitely known as Gary Klein's bikes, and actually very sought out today's models, even several years later than the last production run, which was almost 20 years ago. So kind of interesting that these particular gems, even though the age on them, are still relevant today. What makes it relevant? Well, it still does the 700C. This one I got 28C wheel tires on there. So you got a really decent wheel spanature. I mean, it's not a gravel bike, so you're not going to get the 30 to 40 to 50 even centimeter width tires. But for general road riding, recreational road riding, that's really 28 is about as much as you really need. And then you're not compromising any kind of slowage and that kind of thing with a wider tire. This one did come with little cheater brakes, I call them, which is kind of nice. That actually gives you another hand position while you're riding. You can actually feather those brakes when you're on the bike paths or what have you. So for 90% of the people out there looking to get road bikes or just road riding in general, or more recreational, yeah, you can take this on events. If you wanted to do a triathlon and this is your road bike version, this would be an excellent bike for that. Or moderate racing, for sure. But for general recreational, bike path riding, hanging out with group rides and all that, definitely fits that particular mold fit as well, just like any other road bike you'd find today in any bike shop. Because the top end bikes, when they're like all internal cabling, disc brakes, electronic shifting and all that, really catering to that 1 or 2% of the actual market, which is kind of crazy to think, because they're really forcing that narrative onto what people would not really need. It's like overkill. So that being said, these particular bikes are awesome. Well, what makes it easy? Well, the cables are more external, easier to work on and get to, and all those kinds of things. And the componentry on these, this one has a triple with a 9 in the back, which gives you a huge range of gears, where when they go to a 2 or a 1 by and with a bigger pie plate, shifting's not as smooth and actually you're more limited on that kind of thing. So for me, in my opinion, I'm in Colorado, so we have some hills here, so we have to have the gear range to cover that. And definitely when you're more combination of running on bike paths and rolling hills, you like to find a little more tighter cassette, which means the gear cluster is a little bit closer to each other. Therefore, you can actually find that gear that's perfect versus I got to compromise, work a little too hard or go a little too easy, and then your speeds fluctuate accordingly. Therefore, you're not really getting the most efficiency out of the bike itself. Being aluminum with a carbon fork, yeah, I mean, it's definitely a nice ride. You put a little bit wider tire on there, knock the pressure down a little bit, that'll give you a little more of a supple ride, not as stiff and rigid. There's other things you can upgrade on the bike too. You can do like a little suspension style seat post from Redshift, or a suspension stem if you need to, or elevate it a little bit higher up with their high-rise bars. But that being said, you really don't need to do that much of it. But then again, fit is the most important thing for any bike to start off with. I've had a few Kleins myself from the days and out to now, and I've ridden a couple of them which are very, very nice. And they're very fast, and they are built to last. So between the frame being they had very little issues with the frames cracking and so forth with alloy. And then the newer versions, they did do a mix with the carbon in the back, so you can find a gem like that as well. That being said, you can get yourself a pretty decent one. The last production run was last year. They did actually full carbons. And these are going to be a little bit different than the Trek carbons. I've only had a few in my shop and back then, and only a few to be refurbished. But if you do find one, they are pretty decent. So back in the carbon, they did a full carbon, which a lot of people were not aware of it, so they will kind of argue with you They were not being built in Waterloo, Wisconsin. They did move that production run overseas, so they were built in Taiwan. Those particular bikes were pretty awesome. So I had a pleasure of having a couple to work on, and they are pretty cool. They did have the really high quality paint jobs as well as the attention to detail. So you know that Gary Klein probably had a little bit of input on the design of the manufacturing of that last run. So any case, but spanning several decades from the 80s, 90s, and into the 2000s, they had a really excellent line. Therefore, if you come across a Klein, if it's in pretty good shape, as in paint-wise and so forth, you got yourself a gem. I have gone through a couple where, you know, they've had a little bit of abuse, mostly garage and what have you, but at the end of the day, though, they were actually pretty decent bikes. This particular one here has had pretty light use, not a lot of aggressive riding, and therefore, it's actually a pretty decent bike. And it's going to be great for somebody to start riding, that kind of thing. But looking at this particular gym and what it can do, it's just going to be one of those great rides. This particular one was my mother-in-law's, and she rode it until the point where she's in the age that she's not going to be able to ride that much, and she needs something a little more stable. Therefore, a lot of us have gotten to that age too, and hey, what the heck, we're going to get her something decent. But with this particular bike, it's been named, and it needs to go to a new home where it's going to be greatly appreciated for sure. Well, there we have it. Wrapped bars, ready to hit the road. Give it another thousands of months, thousands of miles to feature. Yes, this bike is going to give somebody one heck of a nice ride going forward. Well, there we have it. Quantum Klein. Several different models, Quantum Pro, Quantum Q, several different ones you can look up and actually find. If you find a gem like this in your neck of the woods, first, number one, you got to figure out the fit is correct, and therefore you can adjust the stem, the bars, the seat, which you pretty much would have to do on any bike, new or used. Therefore, finding a Klein like this, getting it tuned up and ready to go, can keep you under that $1,000 threshold. That allows you to have other income to put towards other things that make your ride much more enjoyable. Gloves, shorts, helmet, shoes, all those other things that go with cycling where a lot of people forget about. Therefore, this will get you into that. And then again, this would be a great addition if you're actually a gravel rider or a mountain biker and want that road rocket just on those days you're just going to be doing bike paths or road riding with the buddies. This is going to be one of those particular bikes. Well, in any case, thanks for hanging out with me in the garage. And again, I'll have other additional links below talking about detailing of the frame, ceramic coating, as well as the wax chain I did on this one, and also tidbits and additional information and learning know-how. Thanks again for hanging out with me in the garage. If it was nice in your neck of the woods, please go for a ride. Until next time, have a wonderful day.